people notice your creative
Yeah, it's
product,
funny.
and that holds you forward, sort of. Sometimes we get pulled into things we never would have
That
imagined
is
for
so true.
ourselves.
Yeah, so true. And I think this often happens with clients as well when I'm coaching. Is this, some of their greatest gifts, some of their greatest superpowers, they couldn't name them if you asked them, right? And you hold a mirror to
Right.
someone and say, "You're a teacher," and they go, "Oh yeah." Yeah. My parents bought me a whiteboard when I was 6 years old, and I used to teach myself toys. So it's this helping people return to or discover who they are. I always seem to do things the hard way and the slow way, which is why I think it's fun to talk about these 10 years in reflection, because some of the things, the patterns and the transitions that happened then, I feel they're coming up for me again, 30 years later. And these patterns affect all of us because they create difficulties in our lives that carry forward. And as a coach, what we're doing is helping people address those difficulties.
Welcome to Titans of Transition, featuring real-life stories, anecdotes, and inspiration about pivotal career moments from leaders who have been there. Join host Joe Miller, former scientist and senior technology leader turned executive coach, as he unpacks transitional moments to help inspire change.
Hey, Sally, welcome to the Titans of Transition podcast today. Really pleased to have you.
Thank you so much.
And so, about what this podcast really is focused on, and that is individuals going through transitions. And, right now we're going through this pandemic bug, and, folks are having transitions thrust upon them. But I also want to recognize that people have been probably thinking about making shifts of their own, whether it be in their career or their personal life. And part of what we want to do in serving the audience is sort of tease out how to be more aware when you're not in alignment, or when you have a sense in yourself you're not fully where you want to be, and it's hard to put your finger on it. And the way we like to do that in this forum is really to hear stories from notable leaders like yourself. And so we're just going to dive right in. And what we're going to do is just sort of have you tell us your story and reflect back with us as you've gone through your career. Very interested in hearing more about those insights you might have, Sally. So let's start with, how did you make a transition from school to your first job? And I should say right off the top, kind of tying back to my intro, a lot of your career is being a notable leader in the area of design. So I'm just kind of interested in how you made that shift and segued from sort of school and got drawn into design in the first place.
Thank you so much. It's a case of life prepared me for education. Things didn't go quite smoothly. I hit a speed bump at the grand old age of 16. I was sort of supposed to take a bunch of exams. I was expected to go to university. Things came to a screeching halt when I didn't pass the exams. And my parents were of the generation that I should probably go to secretarial school and learn a trade. And so I did, and I went there for a year, and I learned how to take shorthand and typing. And
so Sally, we should probably jump in at the offset, onset, and just say, where were you?
Oh, yes, that's right. Where was I?
There might be some cultural overlays there too, potentially.
Yeah, you're probably spotting the accent, right? Yeah, no, I grew up in the United Kingdom in the 70s, and I had both parents, and I have a sister. Dad was a veterinarian who worked for the government, and Mom was an amazing homemaker, and had a very kind of middle class, rural English background. Went to the local school, And so, yes, was expected to sort of jump through the academic hoops, but didn't. And really, really felt that my world had come to an end and that I was probably not even smart enough to learn how to type. But a year later, I paid my dad back for the secretarial program. I found a job in London in the stock exchange, working for the Union Bank of Switzerland Securities, and found myself 14 stories up. I'd never been in a multi-story building before. The elevator left my stomach standing. I had never met anyone from abroad before. And this environment was full of international, very bright people, all very academic. And they all seemed to have systems and terminals and technology to help them do their job.
Very driven, isn't that true? Stock exchange must have been very driven individuals as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Massive overachievers. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was aware and I was embarrassed that I was a secretary. It took me years to get over that. I felt that my failure was just so visible. But I was really struck by the people and the technology and I thought, you know, if this is going to be my life, then I want this. I want more of this. I want to at least not be held up by old-fashioned ways of doing things through the technology, and I want to be working with fun, powerful people. And so that was a big insight for me, and I could never have predicted that, could never have guessed that, and I could not have known that at 18 I was going to be, you know, moving away from my family and being independent and being able to pay my own bills. And that actually was another theme that I had not imagined having at that time, was having a credit card. UBSS was very generous. I had free travel pass for London. And suddenly my world sort of just opened up in ways that were extraordinary, you know.
That's really amazing. So what happened next?
What happens next? Well, I did feel a bit of a heel for having failed my exam. So I started taking it night class programs, and my boyfriend at the time was very invested in theatre, and I was making theatre artifacts and posters for him. And a design agency saw them and said, you know, you really should go to school for design. And I thought that sounded absolutely ridiculous. Why would you need to go to school for design? You just do design, right? But I did. I took a certification program, and the person who looked at my work said, you know, being a secretary is not conducive to being a designer, and you're a designer. You need to go to school. And I'm like, oh no, not again. And so I did. I thanks to my boyfriend, who actually turned in my application. And this was another theme that showed up for me, even when I was being what I would call a bit of a numpty, you know, a bit clueless, a bit thick, a bit bloody-minded, as they might say in Yorkshire, where I originally grew up. People showed up to support me, and so I did. I started a degree program in graphic design. And those 3 years were really fascinating, because in that time, whilst I was, you know, now fully focused on something that I couldn't have even imagined spending time on or even thinking was terribly important, I was now fully invested in creating a new set of tools for myself to be in the world and to create value for other people.
You know, that's really interesting. A lot of people I've coached have gone through a similar self-discovery in the early years. And I think partially because they kind of go down the path that they think is appropriate. You know, they don't really get in touch with kind of what gives them joy, what gives them fulfillment, what they're even good at necessarily. Sometimes the life that their, you know, well-meaning parents had in mind for their child becomes the trail that they're on, the journey that they're on. And it takes some zigging and zagging in the early years to sort of self-discover, well, maybe this isn't it.
Yeah. And I have to say, I reflect on that decade between the age of 18, moving to London, and 28, when I got a ticket to come to the United States, of just being a real roller coaster in personal development. It was like the first 18 years I was under my parental wing. And then the next 10 years I was just sort of went through an interesting spin cycle. It was a little extreme in places, but no more or less than a lot of people have gone through. And, like you say, it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, right?
Yeah. And it seems as though, people notice your creative product.
Yeah, it's funny.
I hold you forward, sort of. Sometimes we get pulled into things we never would have imagined for ourselves.
That is so true. Yeah, so true. And I think this often happens with clients as well when I'm coaching, is this, some of their greatest gifts, some of their greatest superpowers, they couldn't name them if you asked them, right? And, you hold a mirror to someone and say, you're a teacher. And they go, oh, yeah. My parents bought me a whiteboard when I was 6 years old, and I used to teach myself toys. So it's this helping people return to or discover who they are. I always seem to do things the hard way and the slow way, which is why I think it's fun to talk about these 10 years in reflection, because some of the things, the patterns and the transitions that happened then, I feel they're coming up for me again, 30 years later.
Yeah.
And these patterns affect all of us because they create difficulties in our lives that carry forward. And as a coach, what we're doing is helping people address those difficulties. And often they come from a trauma, an incident in the past. And what we're saying is, let's go and look at that together. Let's find a way to inspect it, to create safety around that, so that it can release its hold on you. And then we can talk about the difficulty. It's your boss, it's your family, it's your new job, you've just been fired.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I've seen the same thing in my coaching as well, and personally. All right, so take us forward then. So you went to, you get your design certification?
Took a degree, a three-year program. And I think three things happened. Firstly, my father was hospitalized after retiring, and he did not plan for his retirement, and he did not do well around it. And so he was actually put into a mental institution for a couple of years. My boyfriend at the time, his brother, who was my age, he was killed in a road accident in Spain, and also at the end of those 3 years, my parents also separated. But also during those 3 years, I really fell in love with what I was doing. And even though I was still doing some secretarial work to pay the bills, a close friend of mine, Nicola, who was also a secretary, she said, when she came to my degree show many years later, she's like, there you were typing away, but you always said you were a designer. And I think that was an important thing for people to know, is like, you may be doing one thing to get by, to make a living, but if you in your heart know that you're really this other thing, nothing's going to stop you. And
yeah, it's kind of a side hustle that will come up organically often, and maybe we fight it.
Yeah,
it certainly was true of me. I was a scientist to start with, and after about 9 years, and then I was a chemist, and I started automating laboratories, and then I used information technology, and then I started leading IT, and I was a CIO for 35 plus years. But in probably going back 20 years ago, I realized that it wasn't the processes or the technology, it really was the people and interacting with people that lit me up. And I stayed in contact with many of those individuals that worked for me that had moved on. So it's kind of like you can try to bury it, but it will come back.
Yeah.
And it's where you really find joy. Okay, so you went through your program, and people who aren't familiar with design may not know what a design show is. It's kind of like a portfolio art show almost, is it not?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And all the students who are graduating that year will put their stuff together in sort of a large gallery show.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's in those days, it was mostly print work. when I actually went on and did a master's, it was more computer related work, and so we were crafting kind of interactive things that you would see on screens. But that came later. But just going back to your point, I think, you know, one of the things that really put my father over the edge is he, in the absence of people around him and the structure of the office, he didn't have anything else. And he identified so much with who he was. He was James Anthony Grisedale, MRCVS, you know, head of the Southeast region and he'd done this, well, since 65. And I think a lot of us, as we kind of, as our careers come to an end, we need that. We can't suddenly just take away the people from around us, particularly if we're used to important people. So I just wanted to call that out before I jump on with my story. But also another thread we were talking about was patterns that kind of show up for us. Well, one pattern that emerged for me that was very striking, my response to the tragedy was to isolate. And I realized that I was onto something here with this design thing. I knew it was going to literally become something that was a part of me, and I just could not I didn't have the constitution to also carry my family's woes and my boyfriend's woes. And so I kind of sort of isolated. And there were a few days there where I wasn't quite sure where I was going to hang my head at night, but again, helpful people provided for me. And in just being utterly focused and on the design work, I was rewarded spectacularly. I won a national competition. I became a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and I was the Royal College of Art offered me a place to do a master's program. And again, my professor had known I would never ever think of going to a place like that because of the expense and because I didn't have a particularly high opinion of people who spent so much time in education. Right? I thought they should just get on with it and go and earn a living. Yeah. But I got in. So here I was at the great age of, 25, 26, going to take a 2-year master's program. And at the same time, I had all these accolades and achievements, which were just extraordinary for someone who only a few years earlier didn't think they'd be smart enough to learn how to type.
And what a powerful lesson and reinforcement to what we were talking about earlier, you know, living the life someone else has mapped out for you that isn't really a fit. It's not in your zone, if you will, versus being in that space that you were uniquely gifted for and have natural passion for. What the difference is. It's like pushing a rock up a hill versus everything just coming to you when you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's that being out of joint. Yeah. And I think underlying a lot of the individuals out there might be listening, there's something not quite right. They're not sure what it is. Yeah. And part of the intent of this podcast is to help people deal with that. Yeah. Do some self-exploration, hear from other folks who have gone through, they're a little further down the road like we are, and have gone through very similar journeys to discover, you know, what that passion is, what they're gifted for, until they can really find fulfillment. But anyway, I just wanted to pull out just for a second on that.
It's so important you say that, because I wasn't a particularly gifted designer. What I was good at, though, was taking things I didn't understand and get really curious about them. So the thing that won me the Royal Society of Arts scholarship was that I had never understood what people were really doing in the stock exchange. So I went back and interviewed people and talked to them and put together a little video and a schematic that sort of tried to explain. It might be something you might see if you walked into the stock exchange, and it would give you an overview of, you know, how it worked and what was really going on there in a sort of very basic, fundamental way, maybe. And the other piece I did was also, I had a part-time gig working at a factory, and it astonished me that this factory, Smith's Industries, they make time-related products. I couldn't understand why they could possibly be making money because of the way they structured the factory. And And so I wrote a thesis about the labor relationships of people to their job, the Indian women who had a limited amount of time to do their work and lived far away and commuted versus the white men who had offices and fancy cars. And again, I wasn't coming at it from any kind of data or scientific point of view. I was really curious.
Curiosity. So I know where this is headed, where you are now, but part of the overall design process, I think of interactional design and is the end intent, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe the technical aspects, the graphical design or the manipulation of image or doing vector art or whatever, that's one aspect that most people think of when they think of a designer.
Yeah.
But part of the overall mission or part of the overall process is to really go deep, isn't it, in those areas of understanding what's really going on before you put pen to paper, before you put cursor to terminal, or whatever the right analogy would be.
That's right. And the stakeholders in the early days, before we had these massive platforms, were fairly, things could be done quite with a few people, a really good engineer. I'm talking now less about graphic design for print, making books and posters and stuff, and actually more about creating design to help build products, software products, Yahoo Sport or Facebook, social media.
Or an app or,
That's right, yeah.
Okay, let's go forward. We're having so much fun. We're just drilling in here. What comes next?
Redirect me. Okay, so I go to this master's program, and I'm one girl in 6, and the program is 2 years old. It's innovative for its time, and it's taking people who have some design chops into thinking about how do you bring those sophisticated skills into software design. And we spent a couple of years noodling on things like, could the London Underground ticketing system be improved? And we'd spend a day looking at people who were going through it very quickly because they had a pass, and tourists who were stumbling around. And we also looked at, very industrial processes, like how do you get money out of an ATM machine? How could you? So what we were being introduced to was the idea of design being applied to things that happen in sequence, where you've got a human person, someone trying to get something out of some technology, So this idea of looking at the complete cycle of activity, and that was very, very exciting. And at the end of those 2 years, someone from Apple, Gita Solomon, who was working in Cupertino, she saw my work and she offered me an internship. And once again, I didn't have the imagination to even comprehend, and the boys in the class were looking at me with daggers, like, why you of all people, you don't even want to go, and you turned it down,
No.
But the following morning, I realized this, my future at that point, I thought, was going to include marrying Andy, the cameraman from MTV, and going and working for BBC and helping them make graphic titles for shows. And then I started to realize that there was this other thing. And having, I suppose, by this time reached the final age of 28, which, I think is about the time we really are fully grown up as human beings. And having assimilated all these challenges, I decided to go and explore it, because I thought maybe life could be better there. Maybe.
Did I mean moving house for you then?
Yeah.
Using the terms over there.
Yeah. I moved to Cupertino, and that was in 1993, and joined an extraordinary group of people, even within Apple. It was called the Human Interface Group, the Advanced Technology Team at Apple. They were doing research, and I got to hang out with some of the best of the best, brightest and best people who invented QuickTime. A lot of the stuff that is just fundamental to how we use stuff today, a lot of it was started there. And not being a technical person, I don't think I fully appreciated some of the folks who were there. But that was welcome to Apple.
So yeah, so where'd that go? I mean, you came in as an intern, right? But you had your master's degree and you had other experience. So that's
Yeah,
kind of an interesting question in
it
my
was extraordinary. I mean, I'd never met an engineer before, and yet here I was, paired with engineers, and they were like writing in C++, which is a type of coding language, and I knew a basic coding language that was sort of graphical in nature. And they looked at it and just laughed. I had a hard time, even though I speak English, making myself understood, because my vocabulary was not California or Apple vocabulary. There's the whole immigrant story as well, which took me many,
Yeah.
many years, took me about 7 to 10 years to fully become a citizen. But again, that sort of shaped me as well. And that really shaped me into really learning my craft and keeping my head down and trying to be of service, really. Yeah. So the Apple thing was extraordinary. I was there for 5 years until Steve Jobs came back and closed down the research lab. That was my first layoff experience. That was my first, oh crap, I've got 60 days before they'll kick me out of the country to find a job. I wasn't necessarily there to get a job, but what had happened in those 5 years made me very curious to stick around and see, like what could happen. And one of the reasons for that was I got a chance to work in India looking at healthcare for rural healthcare workers. I mean, this is like the bleeding edge of Apple that most of Apple have never even heard of, and we probably shouldn't have been doing. But there was a portable device at the time called a Newton, and the government of India.
I had a Newton.
You had a Newton? Awesome.
I had a Newton. I love that thing. Although what was the graffiti type recognition used to drive me crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
But I loved it.
Took a while to get it right, but it did work. So I was wandering around Rajasthan, rural Rajasthan, with a Newton, figuring out how we could help collect information about the rural population so for example, we could efficiently get vaccination to rural population, or to be able to provide contraception, so there could be some sense of population understanding. That was just an extraordinary experience. And I do remember standing in the Rajasthan desert one night wondering, why the hell am I here? And I'm like, because I am here. I mean, it is me.
How did I get here?
I have arrived. I'm as good as you get, right? And what was interesting was, like, in that context, even though I was no one, in that context, I was a VIP from another country, from America. And I was very conscious of that privilege as well. So that was the beginning and the start of my connection to India, which has been a theme through my career as well. It was also, another amazing opportunity to get curious and experience watching and learning, and being completely overwhelmed and bringing in my design tools. So, for example, malaria is a big killer over there, and we wanted the nurses to be able to tap the screen and enter information about possible malaria. Well, I think, had decided that if we drew a picture of a mosquito, that they would understand that was connected to malaria.
No.
Like, what is that? We ended up using a little drop of blood because that was the association with malaria. Because when you take a malaria sample, you're taking a drop of blood and you're putting it on a slide, and that was much better understood as a visual for malaria. So, I mean, nothing could be taken for granted in terms of creating a graphical language for this software, because we had to learn the hard way.
That's really interesting. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about this pattern, or this string of pearls that have gone through your journey, to hear more about India maybe down the road. So how long were you there?
You mean at Apple or India?
Both.
Well, we went, this is corporate America. Instead of, what we probably should have done is just gone there for several months. But
Right.
Of course, over the course of 2 or 3 years, we visited probably 10 or 12 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The product never actually got used for its original intent, but the software was acquired latterly, and apparently was very useful for the stock exchange for the data capture of tea when it gets harvested. So that was interesting how that the intent was always to transfer the technology to India. Yeah. So get me back on thread again. We've been to Apple.
Yep. So we're looking for what's next.
Yeah.
And how did you go through that inflection point?
Yeah, it was unclear where to go next. There were what was presenting itself at the time was the internet was happening circa 1995, and I had realized wandering around the rural Rajasthan that even having one device in a village that could get people information, instead of them having to pay someone to get information about, what the cost of corn was, or was going to make a difference. And so I was very curious to learn more about how I could get involved with the internet, because I had a passion at this point to start thinking, how can you enable people? How can you get information into people's hands who previously had to pay for it or didn't have access for it? So I jumped to a couple of places, but ultimately landed at Yahoo, and was extraordinarily lucky to land at a time when, this must have been about 2001, when things weren't going too well financially. And we were able to turn that around a little bit. I was the first design manager there, and a lot of the folks I worked with, they ran things like, some of you will remember Yahoo Finance, Yahoo Movies, Yahoo Sport, Yahoo News. At the time, that was, this is pre-social media, but it was serving literally something like 40 million people, if not more, around the world. And I think what was interesting about that, again, I was there for nearly 6 years. And in that time, I think I really learned my chops as a manager. First, being still hands-on, having amazing opportunity to, for example, with Yahoo Sport, about which I know nothing, to be able, when they said we want this site to be as competitive as ESPN, we want to be behind ESPN in terms of eyeballs, which is interesting because your son works at.
Yeah, we should disclose. My son Keith worked actually at Yahoo Sports. Actually started his career with Yahoo Sports down in the LA area.
Yeah, he was in the media group. And that's another thing that's amazing, because there are so many people who are in that group who are in just incredible positions 20 years later. People who are heading design at parts of Airbnb and like your son. I mean, there were some extraordinary people. And I think there's two anecdotes about Yahoo, which is, it was the first place I learned to say no. Until that point, partly being an immigrant, I always said yes to everything. But when Brian asked me if we could do this, make this kind of significant change for Yahoo Sport, I said, no, I can't do it with what I have, but I think this is how we should do it. I think this is how we should organize, and I think these are the people we'll need, and I think this is the process we need to go by. And he agreed, and he allowed me to bring in a couple of more headcount, and we were able to really understand both the needs of people who were consuming it, but also the needs of the advertisers. And I was so lucky to be able to pull in some just amazing people. Long story short, we did meet those numbers. We did come in number 2 behind ESPN, and we also touched fantasy sport. We also touched covering the Olympics, and I know some of the folks in the team were just like so thrilled to be, involved. So,
was fantasy sports birthed from Yahoo? Seems to me that's the first time I noticed it.
Yeah, I don't want to say categorically, but I'm pretty darn sure it was. So it was. What was interesting about that was I really knew my limitations. I knew I personally could not help the design of sport, and that's what really, out of embarrassment forced me to say, need some help near, need to add some more people. And so as a result of that being a massive success, the other media teams started looking and taking design more seriously as like, well, if sports have that, I want that too. I want to move the needle on movies. I want to, So that was very interesting. It was like, wow, I can put my finger on the ROI of design now. This isn't fluffy. This isn't just making things pretty. This is like, do this and this happens,
So that's really interesting because Yahoo they were in a lot of different content areas and a lot serving many different communities or groups. And I think around the time frame, it really became apparent, we need to really try to make this work, right?
Yeah.
So that was a really important contribution, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other thing I learned so this was the second learning, I think. People only change when shit happens. And people are only... So it was only when people are hurting financially that they would be open to entertaining the idea of making design a partner in the process. And so my earlier attempts to change the appearance of movies so that it could scale were actually went terribly wrong. I rather arrogantly sort of made a lot of changes and assumed that they would be adopted. Thinking I was doing these guys a favor. It backfired massively. And I suddenly had a head of design saying to me, you need to go and apologize for basically being an arrogant jerk and insisting that your designs be made, So this was that moment of, well, two things happened. One, a little part of my heart died. A little part of my zealous, overachieving design purist heart died because I couldn't really accept that they were rejecting progress, right? Mm-hmm. But it also opened me up to the idea of how do I seek to understand as opposed to how do I seek to be understood? Because until that point, I had just been like a fire and brimstone design passion, and you just total zealot and couldn't see anything other than like design, right? I think I nearly lost a boyfriend because he was daring to buy a PC laptop, not an Apple. I mean, that's hardcore. So this was that moment of like, oh God, I don't think I can stay in Silicon Valley. Wait, how do I get to be in Silicon Valley and do design, but in a way that it's not going to hurt me, So that's what I got serious about managing. And for helping the media group, I like a lot of people got given more to do, and so I ended up taking on more responsibility and sort of really had to figure out how to scale the design organization. Because you're right, we had something like in the order of 40 different websites, all competing for attention, all competing for resources. Things like finance was making a fortune, and others like horse racing was not, and equally, it made no sense to have one occasional designer across 40. It actually made sense to create a more centralized approach. So I was very lucky to have an opportunity to help craft job descriptions for the different types of designers, and to be able to start thinking about how could we have a system, a design system, so that we don't need 3 different versions of a print icon. We just have
design
one.
Standards, reusability of assets, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and accessibility as well.
Yeah.
So that was very useful.
That's a major paradigm shift there.
It's huge, yeah, and to be in, and also by this time, mobile carriers were starting, mobile devices. This was sort of the early stage of like, this isn't just about the desktop now. It's actually, we're going to have to start thinking about mobile as well. So yes, it was a lot of the things I worked on were being done for the first time. And there weren't pattern libraries at that point, and things were very much still being made, one at a time.
So, just curious, it's at that time you realized that in order to accomplish what you needed to accomplish, you needed to step into management. But I heard another insight just before there that was like, I thought I heard it was okay to ask for help. It wasn't a failure to ask for help. And that other people, that I wasn't the entire czar god of design. Not all my ideas are going to be spot on, right? So, but inviting other people in to what you were doing, not only recognizing you would benefit, the end product that you were developing, your work product would benefit, but also your contribution, your end goal would benefit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was also became, that's actually when I fell in love with managing creative people, cross-functional people, web developers, interaction designers, visual designers, design managers. And I think that was very much sort of, as a manager, I loved playing people forward, and I loved setting up a safe environment for them to be creative. I was pretty hopeless at managing up, and I was even more hopeless at managing across, but actually putting teams together who was surprisingly good ended up being definitely one of my superpowers. Yeah, and I was then to go on to do it not only in the United States but in India and the Philippines for other companies.
So I think maybe just let's move on, if it's okay, unless you have something else. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what came next as well. Allowing time in particular for what you're doing today.
Yeah.
So, Yahoo to...
Let's just say, by 2006, which was when I left Yahoo, I had been in the United States for something like 14 years, and all I knew was really the inside of corporate America. And I had also finally become a United States citizen, and that was just such a huge achievement. And I think I may have been just a tad burnt out. And so I actually took a career break for a couple of years. I had the extraordinary good fortune to have some savings by this point. So I could afford to do it for a couple of years. We won't get into the how I spent my time, but it was a very useful couple of years out. My mom called it my university break time or whatever it was, but it wasn't also just a break from corporate America. It was also, remember, I spent the previous 10 years sort of putting myself through my own crucible to get to. So in some ways it was.
Sally, I think it's important not to get into any specifics, but I think this is really important because I hear this all the time, especially in technology related fields, but also just about anything, to be honest, where you get to a certain period where you've been running this race hard at it. Certainly those people are notable and have done notable things like yourself. You just have to take a break. I took several, to be honest. I mean, there was several periods where I just stepped out and said, I don't want to work for anybody else. I want to go off to the side and consult. I don't want to deal with that anymore, And, part of it was just the need to pull back and get healthy again, because you always push the work ethic that you need to make the kind of contribution that you have made and others have made, it takes a toll. I mean, I know in the IT leadership area, it's like the power company. It's definitely underappreciated. And, especially if you have responsibility worldwide, you're getting phone calls in the middle of the night about something being down. And after year of things like that happening, you need a break. You need a time to refresh and step back and take another look at things, do something different. So it is completely understandable and very common on the journeys of folks that I've coached and people I know, honestly, not just the ones I've coached. So how did you end up in the coaching area? That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I'll just throw this out. I'm just curious if this is how it happened for you. I was working I spent most of my career working as a CIO in biotech and pharmaceuticals, most of it in the Bay Area, actually, some in Colorado. But I decided that I needed to manage a larger group. get more scale under my belt. So I took a job working for a chip manufacturer, heading up not all of IT at that chip manufacturer, because quite a bit bigger company than I had worked at before, but all the infrastructure and all the infrastructure related applications, if you will, some database groups and stuff like that. And it was tough. It was very tough. And so to deal with that shift, it was very different than pharmaceuticals. And to deal with that shift and to deal with that pace, Moore's Law every 18 months, it was really hard and I needed help. So I reached out on my own and got my own coach.
Yeah.
And it really helped. And following that experience, I said, I'm going to look into this myself.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if you had a similar kind of experience because a lot of coaches I know have kind of come to it that way. So let's hear about that.
Well, actually, it was that last year at Yahoo when I was on a daily stand-up call with some very senior people. And although I was a senior director myself by that time, I'd never hung out with folks like this. And I had to give a daily update on, what's design done for you today. And actually, I've written a blog post about this. You can read about my experience. But they said, why don't you get a coach? Because we need to hear more from you, and you're not cutting it. And I did. Ed Gardner was my first coach, and within 6 months, he was actually helpful in me realizing I needed to step out for my own health. So that was my first experience of a coach. And I have worked with a coach myself on and off for different aspects ever since 2006. I have one today who's Malaria, who's helping me think about how do I connect to my audience as a coach. I've worked with people who've, with different skills, and we come in different flavors, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first time. If we jump forward to 2018, 2 years ago, I was at Facebook at this point, and I was not only at Facebook, I was also in a department that was navigating some challenges that many of your viewers will be aware of, which was Russian interference with the US elections and also Cambridge Analytica hitting. And you would think, well, what's design got to do with that? Well, we had to find some ways to create transparency into advertising, and that involved labeling things that may have political content, archiving political content so the research groups could monitor, see what was going on, and also creating a way that when people pay to do political advertising, it can the process is can be validated so that the company could know that this was someone who was viable, who was a United States. It wasn't coming from somewhere else. And so that's where design could play a role. And I was extremely fortunate to be a part of that. It involved many, many groups, both inside the company and obviously even out in the world of government. It was happening at a level of scale and involved so many people. It was mind-boggling. And, I would lie awake in the early hours of the morning, turn on NPR radio, and I would hear what I was working on being talked about on the radio. I don't know if you remember.
Pressure. I mean, all those eyeballs from outside the organization, so many forces, so many agendas.
That's exactly right.
That's a pressure cooker. My goodness.
It was just such an opportunity to be a fly on the wall. Ultimately, I didn't stay there long. It really wasn't the right place for me. And another piece of this, and I'm going to name this, I've never said this before, but I want to name it because I know there'll be some folks possibly listening to this to whom it will affect. My body betrayed me at about 6 months into the process. I hit menopause and suddenly discovered I wasn't sleeping at night. I had a really foggy brain. I was extremely emotional. I remember having a bit of a cry when I was interviewing someone, I'm thinking, this is not me.
Where's this coming from?
Yeah. I remember getting on the bus to get to work, and it was in the wintertime, and I used to catch the early bus at 7 a.m. And, the bus had been out all night, and so the heating hadn't kicked in. So everyone knew to wear their jacket and their, sweater. And I would be walking in on a silk shirt like this, and my sleeves warmed up, and I was... So I about 6 months in, I remember thinking to myself, I am not going to be able to keep my job. if I'm like this? And I didn't quite understand what was really happening to me. It took me a few months to get help and address it. And sure enough, I didn't keep my job. But what I want to say is I never reached out for help about that, and I never named it. And obviously, I was someone in her midlife, surrounded by people who are at the start of their career, who most of them are in their 20s, and the leadership is in their 30s. And that was another reason where I didn't feel confident to name what was happening to me. I felt yes, it was really uncomfortable, and it must have been very uncomfortable for people like my boss and the people around me to witness someone who appeared to be so senior not actually being their best, right?
Well, that's a huge lesson. And I think some people may not have, I've been to Facebook. I used to go to CIO meetings there. The culture there, it's a interesting organization that many of the viewers may not, and listeners may not really fully appreciate. They had to build technology. This is an engineering company, really.
Absolutely.
They had to build technology that didn't exist. I think people don't understand, they get annoyed with Facebook when they go on Facebook. They have complaints about Facebook. But Facebook was the first platform that I know of that got to over 1 billion regular users signing on, over 1 billion.
Yeah.
So all the conventional, I'm in my IT world now, all the conventional servers and technology just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
They had to build it. And so here you are in that kind of an organization with all these, trying to deal with something that was a pressure cooker for the overall company. You're right at ground zero of that. And you're surrounded by engineers. And, I spent all my career with engineers and scientists, and they're very similar. PhDs in science and engineers are very similar. They are just driven towards the solution, the best solution. I think it's another example, and it's an encouragement to everyone who's listening, that there are times when the very best thing you can do is take a break.
Yeah.
You said before, one of the lessons you learned early on was when to say no.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to say no for your own benefit.
Yes.
And every time you say no, you always feel like you're failing somehow. But really, in order to succeed, you have to say no.
Yeah.
In order to do the important thing, you have to say no to the lesser important thing. So anyway,
yeah.
I know it was a tough time, but my goodness, what a great and encouraging example to everyone listening. It is really okay to step back. It is actually a success to do that.
Well, you're very kind to say that. I have to say, overachievers, like I can feel very negative and down on myself and feel like it was a failure, particularly a failure to the wonderful group of people that, I was working with. However, going back to the coaching, in the months that things were going well for me before things started going awry, I had been so fortunate to be chosen to be part of a leadership coaching weekend where I got to be with other directors from across the company and coached by a group of professional coaches. I think they were from the Exeter group. And then one of them got to actually coach me as after that. And it was her who said to me, "Why don't you be a coach?" And I, in that moment, I thought, what a jolly good idea. And I said, what are the programs? And she showed me a few. And so pretty much as soon as I left Facebook, I thought, this is a really good idea. So I took a 6-month program with CTI called Coactive, and it's sort of the gold standard in coaching. I was so into it, invested, and it peeled back so many of my own layers. I mean, I remember one piece was about talking about discovering the leader within. And it's a very... you have about 26 people in the group, and you all work. You get a little exercise, and then you work on it. And I remember this young girl, asking me what was a peak experience, and getting me into the process. Long story short, what I realized in that moment was I didn't need to have a group, a team, to be a leader. And in that moment,
Yes.
oh my God, the understanding was just incredible. Because I had rather like my father, I had associated my profession with being a leader by this point, because I usually had people I led for, I don't know, the last 20 years or something. And that was huge for me. And so then I decided to do the certification, and I was so fortunate. About 20 friends and connections let me coach them, for my first 6 months. And by this time, this took me up to December of 2019 last year. I was like, I am all in. This is who I am. This is what's going on. And so this is my first year. My ambition for this year is to grow a small private practice. And really hone my craft. And next year it will be to focus more on group work.
Yeah, so it's just such a rich story. And I think it's John Maxwell that says leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And the definition of leadership that most people you would talk to would think more manager and, oversight of an organization or a group of people. But you can't really get anything significant done just based upon your position anyway. I mean, that only lasts for about a minute and a half. After that, you really have to influence people. I mean, yes, you might control salary, but they're not going to give you much unless you're really a true leader for all the different attributes that go along with that. And many of our greatest leaders don't lead anybody. They have a message and they're out there influencing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the first year you've launched off on your coaching. So you have a company of your own. Is that right?
Yes. I called myself Clear Channel Coaching.
And where can we find you online?
Clearchannelcoaching.com.
.com?
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. And are you focusing in any particular areas, or?
I focus on the kind of person I was 5 to 10 years ago. People who are creative, sensitive, who are experiencing some kind of difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
And my clients, interestingly, are in their 20s, in their 30s, and in their 40s, and in their 50s, which is interesting. There's not a lot of them, but they have some sort of difficulty that what I'm noticing, if I was to generalize, is they're seeing that the skills that got them to where they aren't quite going to get them to where they're going to be next. And they're all people who are working at the moment, or who have careers, who are just being asked for more and more and more, and they don't want to burn out, or they have burnt out and they're into a new role and want to find new ways to navigate so that they can continue to thrive. But what is interesting to me is a lot of it actually comes down to a real fear of being visible, or being more visible, or a real fear of being that powerful, of really being a leader. And it's such a gift to be able to invite someone into that fear and say, let's look at this together, and allow that to be seen and come to light. And it could be something that happened way back when.
Back to patterns again?
Back to patterns, yeah. And when I bring it through to myself today, and the pattern that is haunting me, that the pandemic, I think, has really got me to look at, is that isolation, going it alone. And that is up for me. That's what I've decided. I live on my own. I got sick. That was another level of isolation. I'm recovering now. And I'm just decided, no, not doing life on my own anymore. If there's something to be learned from this pandemic, it's not about going alone. And that's why I love this as a sort of a bookend having talked so much about my early experience, about how through tragedy and through constraints, economic constraints, I just had to, emotionally shut down, and somatically in my body shut down, and physically just, like focus, unreasonably focus on something and become brilliant at it, recognizably, so much so that I'm a legal alien of extraordinary ability was my status before I became a citizen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just really invite people to have a look at those patterns that they have, and see what's up for them right now, and make some choices about, is this something that's ready to be let go of, or is this something that needs to be worked on? And if it's something that needs to be worked on, who is someone that you could safely work with? Because it's going to be an obstacle. It's going to be something, a pebble in your shoe, that will carry with you, and you may carry it through your life, and that will be fine. But there may also be moments where you actually have to let this piece of fear down in order to actually grow into your full capability. And that's where I think coaching can help, therapy can help. I know, full transparency, I became depressed the last couple of weeks. I haven't talked to a therapist since my dad died. I've got a therapy session tomorrow morning.
Yep.
And I know I'm not alone. And again, I'm naming it because we need to be able to ask for support sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, awareness is the very first step, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Young talks a lot about that, but I mean, awareness, you have to be able to name things before you can deal with them.
Yeah.
And I think one of the joys I have in coaching is the fact that you can be granted that privilege of being invited in. I love the way you said that, because it's so true. I remember someone saying a line that, to take real care in those situations because you're being invited into holy ground.
Yeah.
And it really is very, very precious. It's especially today, even having a conversation, a real conversation, says I need help, or I'm naming this or I'm naming that, as a real challenge in my life, is extremely hard to do. Extremely, it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And so being on the other side of that, being a coach who knows how to engage with deep curiosity and help people surface things up over time and discover them, it's a real privilege. And so I just want to wrap up by saying I feel it's been a real privilege for me, and I'm sure it will be for others to listen in. I so appreciate your time, and boy, sharing so deeply. I just love your heart. I just hope we can maybe touch base again, maybe another time. There's, I think, so much more to tell. But this has been a real rich time, and once again, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. I loved it.